It will be a sorry day for British Columbia when the forest industry here consists chiefly of a few big companies holding most of the timber and all the better growing sites, to the disadvantage and early extermination of the most hard-working, virile, versatile, and ingenious element of our population, the independent market logger.
Hello, my name is John Brink. I'm the CEO of the Brink group of companies. And to put into perspective another segment of a solo on the BC forest industry and crisis, to put it mildly actually, is somewhat beyond that. But that then being said, I have fairly strong feelings about the forest industry, in particular as to Canada and North America. So I was born in Holland, and my grandfather was a master carpenter. My dad worked in the industry, and it was obvious from a young age that I would be involved in lumber in the forest industry. At the age of 13, 12 and a half, actually, I started working in a furniture factory, and I loved it. And so to put into perspective how I feel about forest lumber and the industry associated around it in Europe as well as in Canada, is that when I grew up, you wouldn't step on a piece of lumber. You simply didn't do that, because of respect for the fiber. However, one of the dreams for me was that started in April the 12th, 1945, when we were liberated during the Second World War by the Canadian Army. I had the dream of going to the land of my heroes, Canada, and further develop that dream, and to not only go to Canada, but go to Canada to build my own lumber mill. I was able to do that, starting with nothing, in July of 1965. Came to Montreal, went across Canada, arrived in Vancouver, and went through the immigration department. Didn't speak the language, didn't know a soul, and didn't have a job. And the suggestion was made then, if I wanted to build a lumber mill, go to Prince George in central British Columbia. I did. And so I arrived here in about July of 1965 and started as a cleanup man in a lumber mill. And then the first impression that I got from lumber being manufactured in central British Columbia is the amazing quality of that lumber. Reminded me of lumber that we used to import from Sweden and Holland when I started up working in forest in British Columbia, in Holland. The other amazing part that I noticed is that the volume of lumber going up the green chain, and then the other volume of lumber going up the burner conveyor into the burners. I could not understand why they didn't do more with that lumber. In fact, some of the studies that were done, as I'm working right now on a book about the BC forest industry, from its beginning to the more current stages, and some of the interviews that were done in those days, is that in early 1960s, some of the key people in the industry, Ray Williston, the Minister of Forest, as well as the mayor, the Matties in particular of Prince George, made recommendations that there would be enough fiber here to support a pulp mill or pulp manufacturing in this region, because amazingly, in the recommendations that were made by a report done in the early 60s by Industrial Forest Service, still in operation today, actually, that probably only 25% of the lumber manufactured was going to the marketplace. The rest would not be utilized. 25% of the timber manufactured turned into lumber. Amazing. And the rest was either left in the bush or wound up the burner or wasted. That created the justification for the pulp mills that then were developed in the Prince George region and in many other ones. The other part that I saw as a potential is timber already then was substantially committed in the region in different forms of licenses. So access to timber was difficult, but I saw an opportunity in either further manufacturing of lumber or value-added manufacturing. And started in a very, very small company. Initially, it was 3 employees, lumber remanufacturing, including lamination or finger jointing. I still do that today now. 50 years ago, when I started this company, Brink Forest Products Ltd., it will celebrate in the next month or two 50 years in operation. We also have a value-added plant in Vanderhoof and one in Houston. Becoming a manufacturer of lumber is not easy because access to fiber is pretty much committed to fewer and fewer companies. Through the 70s, 80s, and 90s in particular, more consolidation took place, where up to more recently, 3 or 4 companies controlled 85% of all the timber in the province. Other things that created challenges is the pine beetle pandemic that reduced the lodgepole pine, in particular in the interior of the province, by probably 75%. And so that reduced the availability, the annual allowable cut, as they say, ACC, by a substantial portion. At the same time, that in order to save as much of the wood that was attacked by the pine beetle and potentially rotting, they pushed up the volumes of lumber being manufactured sizably to volumes that were usually not being used, and where up to 80 to 90 million cubic meters annually were pushed through the sawmills, and possibly up to 1 billion board feet of timber was cut into fiber, into lumber, and that was then put into the market mainly by dimension products. Dimension products are 2x4, 2x6, 2x8, 8 to 20 as the normal diet. That's the production mainly in the interior of the province. We have in British Columbia 2 distinct regions, the interior, where we produce mainly SPF, spruce pine, balsam fir, and then we have the coastal species, distinctly different, being Douglas fir, cedar, and balsam to a certain extent, or hemlock, and more particular as the main species. Manufacturing in the province, in particular down the coast, has reduced over time substantially to a relatively small industry compared to the interior of the province. The interior is mainly from Hope being north. In the more current situation, where because of markets and other policy changes that have been implemented by governments, the amount of annual allowable cut available may not have changed all that much, where at one point we used to have up to 60 million cubic meters annually in the province. It is now in the area of 55 million cubic meters. But because of policy changes, including UNDRIP, the allocation of timber rights, because the unsurrendered rights to property and timber in the province was never committed, that up to 20% of the annual allocat is designated to First Nations and likely will go higher. Getting cost areas under control because of a number of things in policy, that we are considered to be a high-cost producer of lumber, where at one point in time we were one of the lowest cost producers. Between policy changes in terms of old growth, First Nations, and other issues relating to environmental issues, primarily less of the licenses required to supply mills with timber that may have had tenure cannot get cutting permits that usually take a long time or being opposed. At one point, in particular as it relates to First Nations, the requirements that they be consulted, where now they have to give consent. Relationships between the provincial government and First Nations governments, and I'm supportive of what they are doing, but are not as good structured as they should be in terms of making sure that all values are considered, in particular by First Nations and by the BC government. So meaning that cutting permits has become very, very difficult. Hence, looking forward, a lot of the tenure holders that had sawmills have chosen to leave the province, in particular the five major ones being Cadford, West Fraser, Interfor, Weston, Tolko, and some of the other ones have decided to go to other places, mainly the U.S. Southeast. So the question then is, from all the time that I've been in business as a secondary manufacturer, founded the BC Council Value-Added Wood Processors in the early 1980s, and was able to convince government that a portion of the annual allocat should be designated to valuable or valid recognition, secondary manufacturers that would add more value to the lumber being manufactured, where primarily we manufacture dimension lumber, and with the objective, and a lot of times financed by government, of setting up offices in other countries, in particular China, Korea, and other places, including some places in Europe or other places in Asia, to convince them to buy dimension lumber and build houses like we do here. Even when I was still in Holland in the 1960s, we always liked dealing with the Canadians for obvious reasons. They would come down frequently as manufacturers, mainly from the interior, and to convince the people in Holland to build houses like we do. On the other hand, we realized usually that although they were promoting the use of dimension lumber, building the styles that we do here, that would only last until the market increased in prices in the United States, and they would disappear, and so would the supply of fiber. So where are the challenges? How come that most of the people around the world that have timber resources, including South America, Africa, Sweden, and Europe, is that they all, in a way, have gone through the same challenges in a way, in particular Sweden. And I spent some time in Sweden and worked in companies before I came to Canada that imported most of their lumber from Sweden in particular, that changed direction. And rather than making products that they wanted to make and convince others to buy that, they changed direction and said, let's focus on what they need rather than what we want them to buy, and then change their building structure. I believe that's a direction we need to take. We have to realize, and I'm focusing in particular on British Columbia, we in the interior of British Columbia have some of the best lumber and the most attractive lumber for manufacturing and further manufacturing in the world. We should focus on how do we stimulate, and since now is the time, because of all the changes that have taken place, most of the primaries, in particular the 5 major ones, have decided to go elsewhere and have left their mills here, that now is the time to change direction into what I call innovative primary, meaning the primary sector would become smaller physically, the mills, rather than having those big, massive producers of dimension lumber that right now not many people want, but to focus on smaller primary manufacturers that obviously will have more technology, focus more on the products that the market needs, not what we want them to buy, and combination with intensive secondary manufacturing. Working together, innovative primary with intensive secondary. So that then would mean that how do we make fiber available to the secondary sector? How do we get them to invest? Already way back then in the early 80s, we knew what we had to do, since timber is the currency for interaction between primaries and secondaries. We made available to secondary manufacturers up to 20% of the AAC in the mid-80s. That stimulated investment in value-added manufacturing to the point where we had as many as 8 associations across Canada, across BC, and as many as 800 different companies. The policy was changed in particular in early 2000 during the Campbell government of the BC Liberals, who made policy changes that changed appurtency, location of where the lumber should be manufactured in the regions where timber is grown. The second one was to make fiber available to secondary manufacturers and to limit the amount of interaction between primaries interacting with each other, consolidating, fewer and fewer companies controlling more of the lumber. Timber in particular. So then where are we today? So if we look at today, and again, suggesting that the government of today in BC, NDP government under Premier Ibby, recognized in particular with the Minister of Forest, Palmer, that they recognize that there are opportunities in value-added manufacturing. But we have to look back, and how do we create the interest and interaction between primaries and secondaries? How do we stimulate an industry that both recognizes primary, secondary manufacturers working together, producing new products for new markets, rather than just dimension lumber? An issue of the available fiber, as we speak today, is estimated to be around 55 million cubic meters annually. The objective is, because of all kinds of bureaucracy and structures, policy changes, that the government believes that they can probably make available up to 45 million cubic meters annually and get permits to do that, and working with First Nations in particular and communities. However, last year, the volume was in the similar area available, but the only volume available was about 30 million cubic meters. Hence, more mills are short, and so where then is the timber allocation today? Up to 20% of the annual allowable cut is committed to First Nations, and I support that. The likelihood is that volume will go higher. May go as high as 1/3. The other challenge is that if all we have available now is around what the government estimates they want to make available, is around 40 to 45 million cubic meters of timber annually, up to 50% of that volume, in excess of 20 million cubic meters annually, is controlled by 5 or 6 companies that have mainly decided to leave the province. They still control more than 20 million cubic meters. The current government, recognizing that to stimulate further manufacturing, value-added manufacturing independence, they have created a category of the, not unsimilar to the early one that we created in the mid-'80s, of stimulating value-added manufacturing in a small business program called BCT, Category 4, as part of BCTS. Now, BCTS is BC Timber Supply, or timber sales volume, is the portion of the annual allowable cut set aside for interaction between incremental volumes to the primaries in Category 1, or proxies that bid for them, and a portion of that is to stimulate value-added investment. The volume available, though, is of the annual allowable cut of the 55 million cubic meters that should be available, the 45 that the government tries to make available, only 1% initially of that volume designated to the stimulating of value-added manufacturing. That's about 600,000 cubic meters. What does that represent in volumes versus a mill? It would represent the volume of a medium-sized sawmill. For all of the province of British Columbia, clearly not enough. The government of the day recently has doubled that volume to about 1.1, 1.2, which makes it about 1.8% of the annual allowable cut. Still not sufficient. We, among many others, have made a proposal that that volume must substantially increase to stimulate investment in value-added manufacturing, which clearly is the direction we have to create. We have to have innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary, more in the regions, in the communities, but in a meaningful way. If we want to have interaction between primaries and secondaries, we have to make timber available to legitimate secondary manufacturers that are existing, or make proposals that can change the direction of the industry. 1 or 2% simply not enough. So my proposal is to increase that volume available to legitimate Cat 4 or secondary manufacturers to bring in potential investments. So this is a lot of numbers and a lot of things are happening of which we have no control. The one area is that duties, which is a way for industry in the United States to slow down bringing in lumber in competition with the U.S. industry. And they've been able to, over time, being successful in slowing that volume down. However, the industry in particular, under the umbrella of COFI, the Council of Forest Industry, has not been very responsive in terms of interacting meaningful between the other governments in Canada and the federal government in negotiating with the U.S. in a number of areas. The anti-dumping, which is the second party of the duties, anti-dumping, the two together is, to put it into proportion, is right now for companies like us, secondary manufacturers that sell into the United States, would pay 14.5% duties on all the volumes that we sell. That likely will go to double that starting in August to 30% and beyond. That is just the duties, anti-dumping and duties. What is anti-dumping? Anti-dumping is where 4 or 5 major companies, including Canfor, West Fraser, Tolko, and some of the other ones, have been selling below their cost into the U.S. market. And since 2016, that has become subject to additional anti-dumping charges. That already is something that we have known that this would happen because it was part of the 2016 negotiations. The other part that it used to be before that is that secondary manufacturers that had no timber, alleging by the U.S. that it was subsidized, that had no timber, but were buying raw material in the open market in competition with U.S. producers, were only paying duties on the input, the lumber they bought. They called it first mill. Unfortunately, because of negotiations that took place in 2016, in particular, the organizations that negotiated those deals were the Council of Forest Industry and the BC Lumber Trade Council, which are again controlled by 3 or 4 different companies that have now left the province primarily, that they negotiated and ignored the part of representing value-added manufacturers. And subsequently, from that, further damage was created, or less incentive was created for investment in value-added manufacturing. What does that mean? That if you buy lumber for $100 and you had a lot of value to it, maybe up to $600-700, you would pay not a minimum duty, although you shouldn't pay any really, but on the input, but you pay it on the more value you add, the more duties you pay. So our industry, and if you look around the province, in particular northern BC, but also the coast, is if I look at Fort Nelson, Fort St. John, Mackenzie, McBride, Fort St. James, Vanderhoof, Fraser Lake, Houston, Quesnel, and you can go on and on. It's a graveyard of sawmills sitting there that have been shut down, although the timber is still controlled by very few. The big 5 still have 50% of the annual allowable cut of the province. Our company has been trying to buy one of the mills and in particular buy the timber allocated to that mill, but have been unable, or they have been unwilling to make deals with secondaries that can then change the industry? Where do we go from here? Is the question. What do we do? Clearly, we have major difficulty in the market, and obviously, with all due respect to President Trump, is not helping things because the potential of tariffs in addition to the duties. So if we have to pay 30% duties or 33%, add to that 20% of the other ones, that's close to 60%. It's not viable. That's a given. But on the other hand, even this part will change. Trump will not be there for a long time. The midterms come up in a year and a half, and other kinds of things will happen. But the one thing is for sure, we have to change the structure of this industry in terms of we have this amazing province that will grow amazing timber, the best quality in the world, really, and we are not stimulating further manufacturing and products that the market needs and wants, and attract entrepreneurship and investments in capital. The annual allowable cut, what is amazing, we're still growing. For every tree that we cut, we're growing 3 new ones. That the annual allowable cut bed is now likely to be at 55 million cubic meters, although we're only using half of it, likely, that it will still grow higher and higher and higher. 20, 30 years from now, we likely will be at 90 million cubic meters annually, if not beyond. The examples are places like, it's not inventing the wheel. It's being done in other places, Africa, Brazil, Sweden, Central Europe, Finland, all those places. Add more value. Spend more time in intensive forestry. Helps for forest fires, but at least make sure that we have, and treat it like a farm. Don't get all of the timber designated to people that, with all due respect to my friends in Kofi's objective and the BC Lumber Trade Council's objective is to maintain the status quo at all cost. I was with them for 40 years. I was the vice chair. I had to leave because I cannot support that. So still, government spends too much time listening to the lobbyists from those organizations that will protect at all costs the status quo. I say we have to collectively, working with First Nations, working with communities, look at we need to invest or attract investors in value-added manufacturing to change this industry. Innovative, primary. The mills will be smaller. There will be more technology, likely less employment, in combination with intensive secondary, making products the market not we want them to buy, but that the market needs. And we can manufacture here. That's the direction we have to go. We have to develop, with all due respect to my friends, the politicians, that every 4 years we have an election. We elect in BC, and we elect either a left-leaning government or a right-leaning one, who then appoint a new Minister of Forest, who then decides, with all due respect to the current Minister of Forest, but who then decide to go in a new direction. Usually what happens then, every 4 years there's an election, every 2 years they get a change in their portfolios, and they change the Minister of Forest, and again you get somebody new coming in who has different ideas and is being affected again by the lobbyists of the day, which are many, to trying to preserve the status quo. We must have a strategic plan which has been agreed to by all parties in terms of the long-term strategy for the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. To develop a forest industry, we are blessed is the best ground, the best place to grow fiber of the best quality in the world. The market is there. There are no more friendlier products than lumber manufactured here, naturally grown in the province of British Columbia. We are so fortunate. We have to work with First Nations together to develop policies that will attract investments in this sector. And it will. And communities have to be supportive of that. We need to attract entrepreneurship that have these ideas of different directions to go, add more social and economic value to the resource that then attracts capital. We have all those mills sitting out there. It's a graveyard of mills all over the place that being stripped and sold into the United States or whatever they do with it. But let's make sure that we are proactive in terms of what we're doing with the annual allowable cut, with this amazing treasure that we have, the forest of British Columbia, both the coast and the interior. But the two areas are distinctly different, as they are politically. The politics in British Columbia are mainly based on what happens down the coast and the island. Very little representation in the current government in northern British Columbia. Hence, we don't like to think so, but part of the policies will favor those areas. For forest policies, that is also the case. The forest policy northern interior, north of Hope, I say, should be different and is different from the coast. The coast should have distinct forest policies for the coast and the island. In northern BC, they should be separate and different for northern British Columbia. It cannot be one size fits all because they are simply not compatible. So the industry, as I see it, we are still in a situation, a very difficult situation today collectively. And obviously the majors have chosen to leave, but still control up to 50% of the annual allowable cut in the province. Is, as the Minister of Forest said in my podcast that I did recently, it use it or lose it. As this opposition leader, John Lestad, said in my podcast, use it or lose it. And so let's work together, not beating up on investors that have chosen to leave. I'm not against that. They are accountable to their board of directors and have to make choices that they want. And but if you leave, you will not keep controlling the annual allowable cut or the forest in the province of British Columbia. And hence, thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs are being lost in the northern interior. Let's work together as a government, both the federal, but in particular the provincial, to recognize that organizations like COFI, BC Lumber Trade Council, are representing, doing what the top 2 or 3 want to do, and we don't know what flag is on their table today. Is it a Canadian or a US flag? And we respect that, but you must take policies that benefit us here. And that if we want to stimulate value-added manufacturing, we cannot penalize it. If we only have 1% or 2% of the AAC, that simply would supply 2 mills, medium-sized mills. It's simply not enough fiber to create the incentive to do more value-added manufacturing. I believe that people in general have to speak out about it. I have, and it doesn't make me overly popular with some sectors of the industry, but that's the way I feel about it. And that's what I say. When I came here, started with nothing, couldn't speak the language, didn't know soul. I had $25.47 and the dream of building a mill. That was 60 years ago. I started on that project 50 years ago, and I'm still from the day that, as I did when I was young, you wouldn't step on a piece of lumber. You simply did do that. The land of plenty, let's make sure collectively we understand that let's treat it like a farm. Intensive forestry is critical. It will grow more fiber. It will reduce forest fires. Let's use the fiber. Going back to the early 1960s, when the local individuals, the movers and shakers here, together under the Minister of Forest, Ray Williston, came to the conclusion that a study done by Industrial Forest Service concluded that we're only using 25% of the volume that we grow and turn it into lumber. Only 25%. We're doing much better now, but we can do better than that. And better than that is let's make products the market needs and wants, not what we want them to do, how to build houses like we do, because that simply does not work. The success lies in the fiber that we have available. Let's train people to become the best, because I believe the future is still in North America, and the illusion that some of the leaders in the United States have that they have enough fiber, they don't need the lumber from British Columbia or Canada. They do. They simply do not have enough of fiber available other than the parks, and that simply will not happen. It does not make sense to have a park sitting there and saying for the next 2 years you can mow it down and turn it into lumber. That means you have to find an investor to build a sawmill. It's simply not going to happen. They will need our fiber. So let's develop a longest-term policy, at least in the next 20, 30, 40 years, and 50 years, that intensive forestry, looking at how do we create innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary. And obviously, I feel very, very strongly about this. I believe now we are at, things will change. Things will change in the United States. And now is the time. If not now, then when? And who is going to speak up about this, although most people know it? Then, if not me, then who? And so, with no matter what happens, I will stay the course, even at nearly 85. I will stay the course because I believe that BC in particular has a huge potential in lumber manufacturing and become a leader in the world of making products the market needs and wants. Not trying to convince them about building houses like we do, because everybody has his own way, and our lumber is far too good for not only dimension lumber, but for adding more social and economic value and using it for other products. Let's stimulate entrepreneurship, attract capital, and be innovative in recognizing that if most of the timber in the province is controlled by 3, 4, 5 companies. Even now today, 50% of the AAC is controlled by 4 or 5 companies. Just not the right way to go. Either use it or lose it. This is the time. This is the opportunity. Now is the time to make decisions. I believe that even, with The new Minister of Forest has indicated that he is ready for change. I support him in what they want to do, and I will make whatever I can available to them to justify doing what we have been doing alongside with other people still involved in manufacturing that want to go, that believe in BC and believe in the future. In closing, I want to leave you with the idea that we have an amazing future ahead of us, including the forest industry, that times will change, opportunity will present itself. Let's encourage governments to be innovative, looking forward. This is not reinventing the wheel, but this is being done all over the world. It is our opportunity. Let's be proactive. There is a huge future ahead of us for your children, my children, in the forest industry in British Columbia.